Axel was unlike anyone else I had ever met. We met each other as I was walking down the road. I heard from behind me someone shout, "What the fuck are you doing here, cracker?" in English, which was a fair question. And it was Axel. And Axel was born in Guatemala during the Guatemalan Civil War, but his mother fled the Civil War and he was a baby, and he grew up in New York City. While there, he taught himself how to hack computers in order to support himself, but of course he was undocumented, couldn't work. He is, in my opinion, one of the most brilliant people I have ever met. Just an incredibly inspiring and interesting mind, and a real poet. Everyone, as soon as the book was published, they said, "Congratulations, Axel's parts are the best parts of the book." I said, "You're right, they are." And it was just such a pleasure to write with him and to think with him and to continue thinking with him. And this is really the first book event that Axel has been able to attend, so to speak. We're keeping, Axel's keeping his camera off because we've received a number of death threats since the publication of the book. We can't disclose his location, but I'm just so excited to be able to share this event with him and really have him hopefully talk more than I talk. So.
Thank you, and welcome to everyone. It's a great showing for a post-COVID event. Another in the many kind of coming accomplishments of the Latinx Research Center, which I had the great good fortune to be a fellow at when I actually was writing another book, but I ended up writing Unforgetting. So I didn't do what I was assigned to do here, but I did what I wanted to do. So, but now let's talk about this wonderful book here, Border Hacker. As Laura said, this is a book about the relationship, and as Levi said, two young men, for me they're young, and about the context that the story takes place. Like one of the things I teach is based on this writer named Vivian Gorda. She wrote the situation and the story. So the situation here is two young men meet in Mexico and get on this crazy caravan and discover all this stuff about caravans and about Mexico and about immigration policy, etc. But at a deeper level, there's another story, right? So I'm going to focus my questions kind of around that. But before I go into that part, I want to ask you, I mean, what is the inspiration for you to do this book?
The inspiration was Axel. I'd gone to Mexico and I did not have any plans to write a book. I was there to do ethnographic research. I was pretty young. I was 24. I didn't really know what anthropological ethnographic research was. I was kind of learning on the fly, but was suddenly working in these migrant shelters right at the moment, just by chance, that the US and Mexico had entered into this somewhat secret pact called the Southern Border Program, in which the US pays Mexico millions of dollars every year to catch and deport as many people as possible before they can get to the US and ask for asylum. Just deep violence. Suddenly, the terrain of southern Mexico has changed. It's like Humvees with machine guns and people rounding up. Something about the Southern Border Program is that they particularly target women and children because they know that they will be the people who are most sympathetic in the media. You're seeing these like deep kind of atrocities happening, and me trying to think, what am I going to do about this? Can I do anything about it? And in the middle of this, I was invited to march in a migrant caravan, and that's where I met Axel. And suddenly I had something to do, and the thing to do was to have a friendship with Axel, to try to help him as best as I could, which sometimes, as you see in the book, is maybe not very much. But just to be around him, to learn from him, to figure out what his whole deal was. I never met anyone like him. And then when I discovered that he was a computer hacker, things really changed as well. He ended up, we'll talk all about this more, but his skills ended up being noticed by some very powerful people in Mexico. And he was ended up being kidnapped, essentially forced to hack Mexican government officials. And that's when really Axel and I started thinking about, well, how do we raise the alarm? What do we do? And I'd never written a book before, but we thought, I don't know, could we write something? We tried to publish an article. We tried to pitch articles that got turned down. Like, the story's too complex, it's too weird. And we thought, okay, well, maybe we try to write a book. Can we do that? What would it be like? And at first, so I was recording Axel, hours and hours of interviews, wherever he is, trying to get his story. fact check, okay, he was here and we have it on videotape or recorder or whatever. And I would transcribe it, and then I would sit down and I'd try to write something that I thought sounded like a book out of those things, and it just wasn't working because it was all in my voice. This is stilted, it doesn't sound right. I mean, it's the gringo in Mexico trying to talk about this Afro-Latino guy who grew up in New York, and it just doesn't sound right. And I thought, these transcriptions, the things I'm hearing Axel say, are so good, like in his own voice. He doesn't need me as a mediator to quote him. Like, what if, and I went to Axel and said, what if we just, you write part of the book, like, can you do that? And he said, I don't know, I never read a book. I said, I haven't written a book either. Like, let's try to figure it out together, right? And then once we started putting his voice on the page, and especially when he on the page can tell me I'm wrong, I don't know what I'm talking about, let me explain to you what's really going on. That's when it really started to work. Okay, we have something.
So, is Axel with us?
I think so. Axel, can you hear us?
Roberto,
All right, welcome,
it is a
bro.
pleasure to meet you, man.
Igualmente, man. I love your story, and I want you to share some of the love of this story with our audience here, and tell us, so what motivates you to want to tell this story?
Well, there's a there's a lot of stuff that motivated us. It wasn't only me; it was me and Levi at the same time.
Right. But I asked Levi, I want you to tell us what did you want to ante up here?
Well, at the end of the day, what I wanted to go ahead and be sure that it was, exposed, if you want to call it like that. It was how dirty everything is, and it's not what it seems to be. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Like, people pretending to help, and at the end of the day, it's another thing going on. Like, for example, they used to walk me and parade me around, you know what I'm saying, to go ahead and force me to collect money for government from government institutions and pretend like, oh, they were the nicest person. If I wouldn't commit to that, then I would have probably deported or beat up or anything. Anything could have happened to me. So I was just vulnerable. You know what I'm saying?
And so who are these people you're talking about? Let's name names here, bro.
Oh, absolutely. It'd be more than delightful to go ahead and expose them up. Let's begin by the priest, Alejandro Linde. That's one of them. The second one is Armando Vilchis, which is also in the book. And the third one is Irineo Mujica. And the list goes on, bro.
Okay, we're gonna get into who they are more. And what do you call it? What did you want people to come away with in telling your story, Axel?
I wanted to make sure that this at some point reaches, the correct people and do something about it, man. We wanted to go ahead and make sure that this gets exposed. This cannot be happening. I'm still in ground zero, and you best believe I can still witness the same situation happening, even though we're trying hard to go ahead and expose it, and it's still going on.
So, like, I'm gonna move to ask both of you the same question, but let me start with you, Axel. Like, okay, so we're talking about the situation, but what about the deeper story? What do you want people to know about you and your relationship with this young author here before me?
Well, from the bottom of my heart, man, what I want people to know is that there is no such thing as white, brown, or black. We are all the same. And at the end of the day, it's all about love. Look at Levi. He's a Caucasian guy. I'm a brown Afro-Latino guy, man. And that doesn't mean shit when you are a true friend. And this is what we wanted to go ahead and make sure, Friendship, love.
I identify with some of what you're saying, like, as Laura mentioned, I was a guerrillero in the 80s in El Salvador, and there were white people in solidarity with us. And before the war, I kind of had a basic analysis of white supremacy and in relation to us. And then I met people who didn't just do solidarity, but they sacrificed, including the ultimate sacrifice of giving their lives. People from Spain, people from the US that were killed for this ideal of the revolution. So I could really identify with what you're saying, Axel. And so let me ask you by the same token, what did you want people to know about your relationship, your solidarity with Axel?
I also, what Axel said really resonates with me, but part of what I hoped was communicated in the book as well is that, of course, that racial boundaries and barriers are very real. Structural racism is incredibly real. And if we're seriously attempting to try to fight that, then we must ask ourselves, each of us, but I think, as being a white man, like, what is my role in that, and what do I do differently to try to fight it myself?
Mhm.
And part of this book, of course, what happened in this book is real, but Axel and I are also characters, literary characters by the same token, right? You have to write yourself as a character. And one of the things that I wanted to come out in this book was that relationship between this kind of white academic, I'm originally from the South, to like Southern man, and this Afro-Latino, New York.
Working class, right?
Working class, yeah.
Yeah, that's important detail.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And then how do you move forward understanding these kinds of identities to create bridges of solidarity? And when we're talking about solidarity, what kind of material action actually has to happen in relation to that? What do you do?
So I want to get into the kind of back to the situation. Tell us a little bit about what you were trying to accomplish vis-a-vis immigration policy and caravans in particular, and their role and the perception and the reality that Axel referenced.
Yeah.
What were you trying to accomplish here?
I think in the United States, in the US around 2018, when Trump starts to vilify the caravan, is when most Americans hear about migrant caravans for the first time. And the reaction of, say, maybe a well-intentioned liberal person in the US is to say, well, the caravans are good and Trump is vilifying them and blah, 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 blah. And what we try to do with this book is to really kind of trouble that a little bit more, to say, well, actually, that kind of stance frees a lot of Americans to actually not do anything. If the humanitarians down there are figuring it out and they're all good and they're all great, then I up here don't have to do anything. And the reality is that caravans are very complicated because struggle is complicated. And there are different actors with different motives. Sometimes those motivations are helpful or productive or good or whatever word you want to use. Sometimes they're not. But things are complicated. And what's more important to me, and what I hope comes out in the book, is that caravans are a process of struggle, and things are not always what they seem. But we can still learn something from them. And particularly caravans have the potential to transform their marchers, including me and Axel when we participated on one. Because there's something about being on a caravan, you're charging through an immigration checkpoint. And it's really at that moment, there's a profound moment. I remember being 24 years old and marching, being very scared on the caravan and marching through the first immigration checkpoint and not knowing are they going to detain us or whatever. And we all just marched through and nothing happened. And you really get a sense in that moment, like the world could be different. The world can change. And so that's what we were trying to communicate, both the beautiful, wonderful potential of migrant caravans, and that in the US that people have a way of kind of, I think, not paying attention to the actual radical nature because it's less unsettling.
What do you mean radical nature?
Radical nature of caravans to make different kind of political claims than that currently exists in a kind of capitalist structure. I think that if you're a migrant, you can show up and you just ask for asylum. You ask the state, please, can you accept me? And I'm a good person and I'm a good migrant and I do all the right things and the gangs are persecuting me and they're bad. Instead to say, like, I'm gonna go through this checkpoint whether you like it or not, because that's what I'm gonna do. Which I think that really throws into question the whole immigration system that has been set up and the way that national identities work. Migrant caravans inherently trouble the capitalist nation state. They threaten it. Why? Because you need a kind of order to say that this kind of thing happens in this kind of society. And migrants can show up and say, remind citizens that that's just not the case.
So, let me go a little more into the caravans. I have a little bit of experience with these matters. I was one of the organizers of a 2012 caravan called the Caravana por la Paz. We brought victims from the war in Mexico, the drug war, to challenge the Obama administration to change its right-wing militaristic policies towards Mexico and towards migrants. And actually, one of the characters in this book was on that caravan with us, Irineo. He was a secondary player, not holding the reins of power, so to speak. So I want to get into both of your views of caravans. I mean, you're not I hear que tienen contradicciones, like, oh,
Sí, claro.
so there's contradictions, and kind of like, what are you trying to say about caravans that you haven't already said? And I pose that to you too afterward, Axel.
I guess if something else I could say about caravans is that, again, I see this incredible, beautiful, radical potential in them. But if you look at the history of caravans over about the last decade, or even since I marched on them in 2015, there has been no long-term material win out of them for migrants in Mexico or in the US. So there's these kind of spontaneous political eruptions that happen. Maybe a few people get a few temporary documents called humanitarian visas that last a year, then they expire, they're undocumented again. But they kind of happen, you make one kind of political burst, political claim, and then just dissipates. And then just happens all over again, eventually, right? And so part of what we're trying to think about here is, who is running the caravans? What kind of, if there are contradictions in caravans, what is a benefit to them? For someone like Alejandro Sola Linde, this very famous priest who kind of came up framing himself as a humanitarian activist, now is a very powerful person and advisor of Mexico, unofficial advisor of Mexico's president right now. But he's helping continue to run the very same mass deportation system that he once denounced. So he was able to use the caravans to kind of propel himself up into a different echelon of Mexican society. So the caravans helped him, but all of these other migrants who actually risked their lives, risked their bodies, not much has come of it. So we're asking, can we think politically again about what kind of organization would it take to make a real long-lasting material claim for caravans in the future? Are there other kinds of people, other kinds of politics that might step in and redirect this political potential and energy?
Axel, something to add?
I'm with him on that. That's exactly what we always thought of. There's got to be another way. This cannot be happening. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. So I wonder, I'm trying to think. I was an organizer in previous life, so I'm like, okay, who are you targeting with this book, right? You want caravans. You're not saying don't do caravans. You're saying, is there another way to do this?
Yeah.
So then that would imply you have an audience que viene desde abajo, from below, right? So is this going to be translated? Is it going to get to them? I guess, what's the circuitry you're trying to do? Who are you trying to reach with this book? Why?
Well, we hope that it will be translated. We're looking for translators. I am hoping that very soon I can meet with a couple actually in Mexico. As sure as you know, the translation rights in the publication industry, you have to blah, blah, blah. Everyone has to approve, but we're actively looking, and we want it to be translated in Spanish as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the people who we had in mind as our audience were people in Mexico, Central America, in the US, who might be looking for a different kind of politics. I think people are incredibly dissatisfied with both political parties in the US right now. A lot of people are
Really?
yeah. And but no alternative is being offered, right? And we're kind of floating, maybe it's this dirty word called socialism or communism or whatever is going to happen, and what does it mean? Well, there's a long tradition of radical organizing in Latin America that we can draw upon, that Americans, of course, are not very aware of. And part of this book is also trying to refer to that, incorporate that, learn from it, and point people in that direction.
So what role do the Central Americans, in addition to Axel, playing in this? I say this as someone who spent a lifetime on Central America stuff, like, what are they playing in this and in the solution?
It's a great question. I mean, I think right now, part of the role is Central Americans are risking their lives on these caravans and as migrants. The United States, for decades and decades, if not centuries now, has used Central America as a kind of colony, and continuously destabilizes governments in Central America and revolutionary groups who are trying to create a different kind of country or nation or political system. And so right now, I mean, the role of Central American migrants in migrant caravans has just been to kind of be bodies, right? People are organizing, they group together, they march through the caravans. But I think not a critique even that just arises in our book, but over and over again, is that Central Americans don't have enough of a voice within the caravans themselves. And I think, you know, frankly, they don't have enough of a voice in this book in a certain sense either. Axel is Guatemalan. But it's a story about him and me, and that's it. But what we would hope is that in the future, these kind of political organizations incorporate Central American voices much more.
Can you talk about a little more about the role of Linde in particular, and what it does, what effects it has, and what effect it had specifically, because there's stories that are related to him that affected both of you on this journey.
Yeah. Yeah, so for those who don't know, we kind of discussed a little bit about who Linde is. He's this famous priest. When I first moved to Mexico in 2015, I moved to work in his shelter. He was kind of celebrated at this time as this great human rights activist. He was rumored to be on the Nobel Peace Prize long list at the time for all his great work. And he had, the year previous, organized one of the first large-scale caravans. It grew to be over 1,000 people. They went all the way to the US-Mexico border, kind of stared down the border guards there. And that was when the Mexican presidential administration, at the time, Peña Nieto's administration, yes, ordered him to never do a caravan again. That don't do this, like the US is angry and you can't piss them off and whatever. So through a long series of events, Linde does end up leading this caravan that we marched on as well, but he kind of used his influence within the Central American migrant activist community in Mexico to kind of propel himself as a kind of speaker or voice of Central American migrants generally, representing them, speaking on their behalf. And then when this new presidential administration was elected into power, Morena, in Mexico, Linde became an unofficial advisor to the president and quickly changed tactics, frankly, because the US, especially under the Trump administration, was like, under no circumstances will these migrant caravans continue to exist. We're gonna, with the NAFTA free trade agreement, there's a lot of renegotiations of NAFTA at the time, and basically it was threatened that if you don't stop migrant caravans, if you don't keep Central Americans out of the news, we are going to completely sabotage Mexico's economy. And Linde went on the record many times saying, we have to do what's best for Mexico first. So, and that meant mass deportation. And since then, he's been very unapologetic about it, frankly. And I don't know if that exactly.
No, yeah, absolutely. And I followed, like, I see a parallel between, say, the role that the Democratic Party played in US immigration policy and politics. When we were, kind of taking it to Obama with the Dreamers and Endelon, a bunch of groups, exposing the farce of Obama's kind of hope and change and all that bullshit. When in fact he was the deporter-in-chief, he became the initiator of the practice of caging, separating Central American children from their mothers, and putting thousands to their deaths in the deserts. I've gone, seen the bones, been in the morgues, talked to the families, seen the slit wrists of the mothers. So it seems like Linde in Mexico is playing the similar role where you have the Democrats kind of like seeing a threat and then suddenly kind of like aligning and taking head of what's known as scholarly term, take out, it's hegemonic control. Actually, it's more of a political leftist term. Establishing hegemonic control over the immigration policy. Seems like there was I know the caravans, I helped work on some of them, and there was some legitimately left radical people with honest intentions. And then it seems like you have these powerful forces in the garb of, religion coming in and aligning the caravans in a way that doesn't interfere with the larger kind of political game actually. What do you think?
I think that's exactly right. It's funny you say that. Yeah, at the end of the book, Axel and I kind of have a conversation where we compare Linde to Barack Obama, actually, specifically. And because he is exactly this kind of very suave, charismatic force that smooths over the contradictions of the Democratic Party, as opposed to being the party of the people and of peace and of justice. And meanwhile, Barack Obama's deporting over 3 million people, right? And so Linde is playing something of a similar role in Mexico as well.
Let me bring it back to the story, the underpinning of this larger epic you're trying to get at. And let me start with you, Axel. What was the most difficult thing for you to talk about? You reveal a lot of secrets about yourself and your life, and as someone who had to lead a clandestine life, I identify with a lot of what you're saying. So what was most difficult about coming out about?
Everything was difficult. Everything. I mean, since me sharing one of the most private stories, sad stories that happened in DC when I was raped, and I was just a kid, that was tough for me to go ahead and bring it up. The rest of it was just the way it was supposed to be. We wanted to go ahead and get the real stuff out there. So I have no option but to tell the truth.
Do you maybe want to talk a little bit about how obnoxious and prying I was at times, trying to get you to say more from the book? And
I was going to get to that, but what's the most difficult thing about working with Levi? Give us the real deal, bro.
Oh man. It was kind of hardcore at the beginning to go ahead and just open up. It wasn't that easy. It wasn't that easy, believe me.
What made it easy? Easier.
What made it easier? When I finally hacked his ass and I realized that he was not a DEA office.
All right, he's cool. The feds are after him too, so it can work.
You know what I'm saying? I mean, I have to go ahead and perform my fact checking on my own, by hacking him and realizing that he wasn't any government related DEA or whatever. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, I gotta talk to you about some people I know later, bro. So, now you get your revenge here.
Oh yeah.
So tell us, what was the most difficult thing about working with Axel?
Well, I think it was, I came into when we finally decided to write a book, and we're kind of saying, well, we want to write this book to kind of expose what's happened to Axel, that he was kidnapped and forced to hack Mexican government officials. And I'm thinking, like, okay, journalism, fact checking, truth, hard evidence. And part of Axel's story and part of many migrant stories is that that's not the case, right? Like things are really complicated. You don't always have proof in the same kind of journalistic standards and whatever. And I was trying to fact check him. I was like, dude, you said that you were here at these dates, but actually, what about, I think maybe you're over here instead. And part of the process was letting go and actually embracing a certain amount of uncertainty that journalism can, at times, this kind of a certain orientation toward journalism, which is not all journalism, but a kind of if we can't fact check it in this very particular way, then it's not true, or there's nothing interesting to say, or it's not worth saying, or it's just lying, and lying is bad. And actually, what a breakthrough I think for us in the book was when I finally let go and was like, dude, he's telling his own story and his version of events, and sometimes he's saying like, don't ask me that. That's off limits. which says something in itself and maybe says something more profound. And so once I think, got there, once Axel was able to finally kind of break me down and say like, yeah, I'm not going to tell you everything. You don't deserve to know everything. The audience doesn't deserve to know everything. That was more interesting, I think, and said something deeper.
So, let's see, I go different ways with this. Right, so part of this reads like a coming of age story. I'm getting to more the storytelling part because that's really, we have some journalists in the room here, or aspiring journalists, and I want to take a moment to ask some journalistic stuff about, like, and let me ask you, Axel, first. Okay, in addition to your just hacking his ass and finding out what is up with his life, what in the way that Levi spoke to you, asked you questions, gave you a comfort level to able to let it make it easier for you to spill your frijoles?
It wasn't that easy. It wasn't that
easy.
easy.
Make it easy. What in the
I
way
just
you
decided.
approach you?
Well, here's the thing. Slow peel off the onion was once said. It took time for me to go ahead and truly said everything that needed to be said. But at the same time, I just trusted him with all my heart.
But why? You didn't always trust me.
No, not all the time. You know, at the beginning. But little by little, you kind of earned my trust. And the reason why, I guess, it was because of me being in a different scenario where the only guy who was from the US was you, and the only people I knew and I grew up with was people from the US, and you knew everything I knew. So I felt like home by being around you, honestly. That's it.
What about Axel's story drew you in further and compelled you to really just kind of go for it? Like, you know, the adventure part is like, fuck it, I'm gonna do this, because you described that.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, there, you know, in the marching on this caravan, you know, young guy, I felt like very out of my element. I didn't, you know, I was very much learning on the fly as well. And when I met Axel, I also kind of experienced this similar feeling of home in a certain sense, like, oh, I can share something. But of course, it's not just anyone. I met a lot of gringos in Mexico that I couldn't care less about, you know what I mean? But meeting Axel was, I mean, just in the beginning, like you hear how Axel talks, his bursts of like vivid poetic language and cutting right to the heart of the matter and telling me like, I don't trust you, maybe you're CIA or DEA, or why are you here? And that actually drew me in more. You know, he's willing to speak his mind, and he has a very particular sense of justice, and Axel's willing to risk his life in order to do that. And that's something I saw very quickly was when we were marching on this migrant caravan, before I knew he was a hacker, before his life was actually in danger. Axel was always the first person, if we were charging through an immigration checkpoint, put himself up front, protect the kids. While we're marching in the heat, 120, 130 degrees on the asphalt on the highways, Axel's carrying a baby that's not his, he has nothing to do with it, but he's doing it, spending the last dollar he has on baby formula. Seeing that day in and day out, thought, geez, there's something about this guy that's just so compelling and draws me in, and I can't stop thinking about it. Yeah.
Okay. So there's a kind of a coming of age story in this.
Yeah.
You know, you didn't set out to go out and write Young's journey to write a memoir.
No.
How did it end up being this coming of age story for you? What is your coming of age? Where did you start and where did you end up in your internal process? That's what, by the way, young journalists, the part that we're talking about time, you need to embed yourself. You need to embed yourself in the communities that you're working in, because otherwise you're paracaidista. What does that mean? parachutist. You're just parachuting in and out. Versus, say, there's elements of journalism in this. He embedded himself in this community that for an extended period of time, you're going to get people to respect, learn their language and their ways more, which is something I respect about, this doesn't read like the thing of un paracaidista. And I, salute you for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
So the coming of age story.
Yeah. I wanted to, again, like the events in this book are real, but you have to write yourself as a character always, right? No matter whether you see it as that or not, you are writing yourself as a character. So when I sat down with Axel to write this book, and we were talking about me and my role and my character, something that I wanted to communicate was, a coming of age why, not just to say, oh, I marched on this thing and it all turned out good in the end. Because I think that the book really tries to refuse just a normal kind of happy ending. Instead, what I learned living with Axel, traveling with Axel, with other migrants was, it's a process of struggle and transformation that growth is painful. And I was marching every day with people, marching with Axel, and people risking their lives to make a political claim, whether they framed it that way or not, by saying like, I deserve a life in this place. My children deserve food, they deserve schooling, they deserve opportunities, they deserve health care. Axel, after he's kidnapped and forced to act, saying, I deserve to not have to live in hiding for the rest of my life, and I am going to risk my life, strangely, paradoxically, so that other migrants don't end up in the same situation. Learning through him, learning the bravery that it takes, someone who is not just undocumented, but stateless, who has no country, is not even recognized as a citizen of Guatemala, to stand up and say, like, I'm trying to expose these people because I don't want this to happen to other people. And if you go to Mexico right now, some of the people we're talking about, these horrific conditions in these migrant shelters, they still are there operating the shelters. And there are still people, especially Armando Vilchis, who was the person who kidnapped Axel, he still has people locked up in his compound today if he went down to Mexico. They are not allowed out. They're forced to work every day only for food. If they don't work, they don't eat. And Axel stood up and said, I don't want that to happen anymore. And seeing that, you're like, well, if he's doing that, surely I can do something myself. Surely I can risk something of myself, right? So that was the part of the coming of age I was trying to communicate, that we are not just full coherent subjects. We just march to the world and we're just normal and we are who we are. We are changed by people, and we can continue to be changed, and we should continue to be changed collectively. And that's what I wanted to kind of communicate in this coming of age story arc.
Yeah, I totally identify with it. The way, like, I crossed all the northern part of the continent. Then later on, I went across the whole continent to look at mass grave sites. And I realized, shit, I'm writing a story of devalued life, a chain of devalued life that ran from El Salvador to the borders of Texas, where you have mass graves in Texas with the remains of migrant children, migrant mothers, over near McAllen, Alice, Texas, that region there. There's mass graves in Brooks County that we visited. So I see this as there's a subtext here about what happens to devalued life and the way that power integrates itself in there. Yeah. So let's have a moment here to hear, and I like, to have people hear what the words are like. I'm a writer. Let's hear what the words on the page sound like. What's the story sound like? So I can maybe both of you read?
Yeah, sure. All right, so this is a passage in the book. Axel and I are waiting for him to be picked up by someone who's promised to transport him to Mexico City from another area of Mexico. It's the moment also where things are just not really quite adding up to me with Axel's story and who he is. And so we'll just begin there. One morning before sunrise, the attorney called and said that Don Armando would pick up Axel and Lalo sometime that day, though when exactly she couldn't say. She instructed us to sit in Chahuites' main square so that we could hop into his van as soon as he arrived. Don't make him go looking for you, she said. He'll sooner leave than exert any extra energy. We sat in the shade of a convenience store, where we were less exposed both to the sun and immigration. I bought us Cokes and cigarettes, and we settled into the long wait. Chawites was suffocating and silent. Every once in a while, a lone figure would shuffle by, a stray dog who looked us in the eyes, or a man carrying a machete who didn't. To pass the time, we conducted interviews. It was a habit that we were used to by then. When Axel didn't have a computer gig, and there was nothing else to do in the shack, I'd pull out my notebook or recorder, and we'd begin to talk. I'd ask Axel questions for hours and hours, and he would respond. The questions sometimes had no real point, except to keep the conversation going, and his answers weren't always answers, but rather long, drawn-out stories about his past, stories that had no real conclusion or climax, just events that blurred into other events or non-events, until I asked a clarifying question, and it would start all over again, a back and forth, like I was hunting for something, and he was either trying to find it for me or to keep me from finding it. But what exactly that thing was, neither of us seemed to be certain. All I knew was that something wasn't making sense. I wanted to know why Axel had blocked me from seeing his Rough Rider Quest Facebook account, and why his new account, Axel Brooklyn HQ, photos were conspicuously absent. There were also little moments when Axel seemed to have ascertained knowledge about me that I could have sworn I hadn't revealed. For instance, he once referred to a conversation I'd had with my girlfriend. During the Via Crucis, the migrant caravan, Axel had added her on social media as well, and when she asked if I knew who Rough Rider Quest was, I shot off a quick message without thinking. It's just a migrant I'm working with. Just a migrant? Axel had cackled the next time he'd seen me. I'm just a migrant to you? I didn't understand what he meant at first, and confused, I changed the subject. It was only days later that I remembered my message to my girlfriend, but by then, so much time had passed that I wondered if I was just being paranoid. In Chawites, however, the questions I'd previously pushed to the back of my mind kept forcing their way to the front. Watching Axel fixing computers had been equal parts thrilling and unsettling. It made me rethink exactly what Axel had accomplished when he thwarted the police jammers, and why he had so impressed Father Solo Linde. In the heat of the moment, I hadn't asked questions. I was just relieved that Axel had found a solution, but how? How on earth did a man like Axel know how to outfox a federal police unit? And what else did he know? And then I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit. We have more of a conversation. And then, okay, I'll start right here. Dude, I said, I know I'm always pestering you with questions and asking you all this intrusive stuff about your life, but now you listen to what I have to say for once. You're right. I don't know what it's like to be deported or what it's like to run through Mexico, but I marched next to you. I've been sending you money that I don't have so you can travel, and I came all the way back to this hell on earth for you. So I want to know what the deal is. What happened back in Hermanos that day? Axel looked me in the eyes. All right, Levi. The truth is, bro, sometimes I'm forced to do things. What kinds of things? Things that is not exactly legit. He shifted in his seat. Illegal things. In that moment, it felt like the world narrowed, and all I could see was Axel. The relentless heat, the endless dust, the insufferable town of Chawites, all of it melted away, and the only thing I could feel was my heart pounding in my chest. Ah, screw it, he said, and a big smile cracked across his face. You caught me, motherfucker. I'm a hacker.
So, Axel, do you have the book with you?
No, unfortunately, I'm at a random, extremely fucked up location, bro. I don't have anything with me.
Okay, then let me ask you. I'm just saying axe the way we used to say axe, like AKS. Just like so, because I listen to Axel and I just hear my homies from growing up. Tell us, what is it like for you right now, given what you just said? What's the life of for you right now, especially since the publication of the book?
What's it like for me? You mean
Yeah.
how do I feel?
What's life like? What's your daily life? How does it feel? What are you feeling, thinking? Ever especially since the book came out, what's it been like?
Well, I'm still in the bubble, man. I'm still a nobody. I'm still a ghost. I'm still in jeopardy. And I don't care. I'm fine with it, you know? but that kind of tells you exactly how I feel. I mean, I'm glad that it came out. You know, at some point, I'm so happy that it came out because now people is gonna read it and see exactly how it is. But if you ask me personally how I feel, I'm in the same bubble. I'm in the same boat.
What's the same boat?
Not being capable of going out freely did not exist, not being capable of getting a job, not being capable of being a regular human being like you, Levi, everyone else, but just being locked up at a random place because I'm stupid bureaucratic shit.
Well, do you maybe also want to mention, since the book came out, I mean, you faced a lot of death threats. You want to talk about that?
Well, that's exactly, at some point, that's exactly what I'm trying to refer to. But yeah, that's exactly what I mean. I mean, sooner or later, man, you know, we had always discussed this with Levi, man. Oh gosh, man, we got to find a way to get out of here. I have to find a way to get out of here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what, I want to ask you what you guys came up with, because then we'd be descompartimentando, decompartmentalizing.
Yeah.
So, no, I just said a lot of love your way, bro. And I think everybody, I can speak for everybody here, we're moved by your condition because it's your unique condition because of unique circumstances. But I hear echoes of like what a lot of the, like, you know, the dreamers, these young people that were, you know, born in Mexico, Central America, and other parts of the Americas and the Caribbean, having to come here as children, not really knowing the homeland, and then suddenly finding themselves deported back to the homeland and making ways for themselves. And in some cases, keeping on stirring shit up despite those conditions, which is really admirable, actually. I salute you for that. You know, having a willingness to come out in this book and tell your story and do the things that you did despite the circumstances. Te saludamos, man. Really. Thank you for
Thank you,
doing that.
Robert. Thank you so much, Robert.
Hey, bro, put the O on my last name, on my name, bro. Robert's my
Roberto.
name, man. Roberto. Like
Gracias,
Malcolm X,
Roberto.
Malcolm and the X, Robert and the O. All right?
Roberto.
Bye. So let's, before I open up questions, let's see if there's a kind of a message, a preliminary closing message you want to leave folks with. Axel.
Oh, my message to everyone is don't give up, no matter what. Don't give up. I haven't given up. And I'm close to be killed. So I'm not going to give up. Truth deserves to be out there. And this is exactly what we're trying to accomplish with Levi.
Okay. Gracias. ¿Y tú?
Pues, you know, we hope that the book does two things in the world. The first is that Axel, again, as a stateless person, has no documents. This book, we hope, works as some kind of form of document, a very imperfect document, but it does document his existence in the world. Through it, he now gets to say, like, I exist, here it is, like, which he's never been able to say before. And we hope, of course, that the book brings him more documents then, that finally Guatemala will recognize him as a citizen, as it needs to do, that he's able to travel to other parts of the world freely, as he should be able to do. The second thing, though, if that's kind of in some ways, a very kind of like micro thing that working for Axel in a particular way, the larger message I think that I hope that we share is that through our story of a kind of friendship of two people who should not really be friends on paper, we see that and we offer ourselves up as a kind of imperfect literary example of the kind of organizing that we hope to see more of in the world, and we think is urgently needed at a moment where we have mass climate change, mass border militarization, incredibly disgusting wealth transfer to the upper echelons of society. Can we think about how to organize across international borders, racial borders, gendered borders, and make requests collectively again? And that's what we hope that in some sense this book tries to think about and does through a literary tale.
Well, beautiful. With that, before we applaud at the end, questions. Floor is open. Please.
Hey, everyone. Was there really any backlash to the book that you didn't expect when you were releasing it?
Yes, yeah, few things. One is these death threats. I was living in Mexico City at the time when the book came out. Got a death threat a few days before the book came out, and the government of Mexico City thought it was credible enough that they gave me a police patrol stationed outside my building. They said it comes with a caveat. They don't know they're guarding you. They know they're guarding this block. Why? Because if they knew they're guarding you, they could be bribed into giving you up. So if at any point they come around asking about your name, asking where you live, it's a very bad sign. You need to get out of it. Not long after that, my phone was hacked. And then it seems as if they went through my list of contacts, only found Axel's contact information and attempted to phish him. And if they'd been able to do that, hack him, then they would have found his location. Very, very dangerous. He could be dead today. Fortunately, Axel, as a hacker, recognized what was happening, and that didn't happen. But then shortly after that, the police, suddenly, I get a call from my landlady. She said, "What are you doing in your apartment?" Nothing. I'm a writer and academic. Pretty boring Saturday nights most of the time, you know. So the police are coming around, and they're saying, like, there's disturbances in your apartment. They're asking about you. They're asking the neighbors what unit you live in. When do you come and go? All this stuff. I said, "Well, what?" And we start talking. She said, I tell her about the police patrol. Sorry, I wasn't supposed to tell you. She says, "Oh my God, in the middle of the night for the past week, someone's been trying to pick the lock to the front door of the building. I just thought it was some random guy in the street. You're in danger." She starts screaming in Spanish. Get out right now." I just sprinted out of the apartment, cell phone still in my hand, and hid with friends for a few days until I could get out of the country. I haven't been back since. Now, that's a scary story for me, but it's way scarier for Axel. You know, like, what are the chances that they would have actually killed me? Probably pretty slim. That's not the case for Axel, right? So this kind of, we thought maybe we'd get some death threats or people would be angry, but we didn't think the intensity, the hacking, the police coming around, that's been pretty scary. Yeah.
Thank you. Other questions? Doctora.
Hola, ¿cómo estás?
Bien, ¿cómo están? Felicitaciones. ¿Puedo hablar en español, verdad?
No.
Sabes, dos cosas que me llaman la atención, porque tu libro, además de presentar los intríngulis of those humanitarian thing, también poses some trickiness, o sea, muy truculento way of para ayudar a la gente. Sin embargo, hay una pequeña contradicción porque al mismo tiempo que estás denunciando, estás diciendo, esto es shelter y ese padre es un ejemplo de lo que puede pasarte si también estás contribuyendo con la campaña de no migration.
Claro.
Al mismo tiempo,
Sí.
hay cosas como que la gente va a migrar por razones humanitarias. Pero la verdad es que la gente migra porque las medidas económicas que impone the foreign policy of the United States en esos países como Guatemala, El Salvador, en aquel tiempo Honduras, todo eso, inclusive Venezuela, pues están ahorcando a la gente y ellos lo saben, pero eso nunca se publica. Entonces, ¿qué opinas tú de ese cóctel que te estoy dando ahí, porque no sé si es una sola pregunta.
Molotov cocktail?
No, no,
It's
no,
Venezuelan,
no.
so I people do that.
No, esa no fue.
No, no, gracias por la pregunta. Creo que voy a hablar en inglés otra vez porque
Bien.
creo que no hay todos, hay unos hablantes que no, pues unas personas que no hablan español, pero I think it's a very good question and an important question. And what we hope, I think, yes, we are exposing particular humanitarians in this book. But what I hope we do, rather than saying, well, these people are bad actors, and then all we need to do is replace these bad, immoral people. Rather, it's kind of a critique. Of course, this, again, it's a mainstream book. This is an academic book. I would talk about the structure of humanitarianism, what it does on behalf of the capitalist state to perpetuate these kinds of things moving forward, right? We try to talk about that in somewhat frank language in the book, but not in this kind of academic. But what, all that to say, we see it, I believe, as a kind of critique of a humanitarian system in general that continues to perpetuate certain injustices. That actually things like the asylum system exist to a certain extent because a few people are allowed in so that the majority can be excluded, right? And that doesn't mean that asylum attorneys aren't doing incredible work. I know really, really good humanitarian activists and immigration attorneys who are working their asses off in a terrible situation. And I really celebrate that. But the book is also to ask, is there some other kind of form of political action that we can do instead? And what does that look like? How do we organize to do that? Your second question around this kind of contradiction of maybe giving the right more ammunition to say, well, oh, yeah, like, you know, that these migrants, it's, you know, it's not just humanitarian, it's economic and all of this stuff too. I mean, our answer is that, again, kind of this humanitarian rhetoric that is framed as left, which I don't think I at least don't see as very left. We have to be able to get past that kind of democratic rhetoric, right? And say, well, actually, like, if what I want is open borders, frankly, and it doesn't matter if it's for humanitarian reasons, because the gangs or the whatever, doesn't matter if it's economic reasons, even though all of those things are important and we should talk about them. It's just that people should be allowed to move without being detained. And that's hopefully what comes through in the book.
It is another word.
So just piggybacking on that, one observation I did have is kind of a criticism. The way that there's this one revolutionary Sandinista guy. He comes out looking really shitty. And if Martian landed and read your book, they would think revolutionaries are shitty.
That's wow.
And
I didn't mean it that way, but I can see how it comes off that way.
yeah, I didn't
Yeah.
think you meant it that way, and
Yeah.
I cut you some slack.
Yeah. No, you know what? It's I think maybe a failing of the book. I think you might be right. And it's just I wasn't really I was just interesting character that popped up, but maybe it's
I was just thinking about it, like, you know, I know people in those caravans, and there's people that are legit and honest and good.
Yeah.
Y que se sacrifican.
Yeah.
And then there's those, I mean, the book is about just kind of taking it to these ones that are not.
Yeah.
But I always like to leave a little space for like,
you're
what do you call it? Just an
You're right.
observation.
No, I think that is a very fair observation and an important one. You know, right now I'm finishing up my dissertation. I hope to publish the dissertation as a book, and it's on many of the same themes, even if it's more academic. And in the dissertation, I go into a lot of depth actually about different kind of activist spaces or caravan spaces, or who I see as doing incredible work. And so if the book only comes off as trashing everyone and saying everything is bad, then I think it's a failing of the book. I hope it doesn't do
No,
that.
it doesn't do that, because there's people that are doing great things, starting with Axel.
Yeah.
So no, but I just had that observation.
Yeah.
Make sure. Other questions?
Did your publisher significantly edit or censor your book in ways that you weren't prepared for? And if they did, can you share?
Yeah. I
Great
can
question.
totally. Yeah. Yes. the short answer is yes. We submitted the first draft of the book. So we have one of the activists who we kind of profile. It's called the attorney in the book. We never share her name. We did share her name and a lot more of her background in the first draft of the book. And then our publisher's attorney said, she's gonna sue you, cut it out. We cut her name, we cut any identifying information about her, which I tried to fight, but at the end of the day, they're like, nope, like, and so that was a big thing. There also, I think, a constant struggle for me. I'm writing the new preface for the paperback edition now, and I just got feedback from my publisher, and they said the first half is great. The second half veers into the polemical. You become very soapboxy and ranty. I thought I was just better contextualizing our politics and the political claims we're trying to make. And they didn't really like it very much. So it's a balancing act as well about, like, you know, how much can you talk about revolution or not? How will they accept it or not? And but so that's in there. But the main thing, I think, was especially the attorney and other what we see as pretty egregious misconduct by some of the other migrant activists. What can I say about that we had to cut? Because again, you need a certain standard of journalistic proof. It's incredibly understandable. I get it, but working with migrant populations is very hard because the people who can testify to it disappear. They're no longer there, right? I could say, okay, very generally, we believe to have witnessed a pretty extensive, not only human trafficking operation, but sex trafficking operation. In which sometimes sexual favors were exchanged for forged immigration documents. I can't say who we believe was doing that, but again, you read the book, there's a few characters. And so there's a lot of those things that you don't have substantial journalistic proof for, again, understandable, but it's like, it's happening, and what can you do? You know, you have to cut it out of your book, otherwise you could be sued again. So what part of the book is, in some sense, an invitation. We note in the book that a Mexican journalist, who we don't name, she asked not to be named. She's a very famous Mexican journalist, also has received death threats in Mexico, and so asked not to be named for that reason. But she encouraged us to write the book because she said, we've heard about a lot of these things for years, but it's very hard for us to get the funding to report it on ourselves. But maybe if it gets published in the US, then it becomes a way that the door cracks open a little bit and we can go in and do more work. So we're hoping that maybe that happens as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Good question on publishing, because you have to navigate the lawyers on the one end, then you have to navigate, if you're left of center, like just notice in literature, it says there's a leftist can't write. Either that or something's going on in publishing. So there's like a liberal Democrat imaginary at the center of publishing that you as a left writer have to navigate to get published. So most of what you see on the shelves won't go beyond like an Obama Biden liberalism. To get it there, you've got to do things like practice, and I see elements of that. We have to practice what I call the strategic power of the sublime and the beautiful, so that you may not like my politics, but you got to respect my words because they sing. And it kind of cuts through in a unique way to write well and write beautifully, to get the story out, because it's really hard. If there wasn't like an adventure in here, this would never be published by a mainstream publisher. I can just imagine, you know, I mean, the question I would have asked too is, like, what did you do with how did the forces of exoticization and exoticism come at you, and how did you navigate that in the process? But I want to leave other questions.
Might be a bit of a silly question given the I think you said non-traditional publisher having to take the type of book like this, but I felt reading the book that this was the best thing I've read in the last 5 or 10 years. It really touched me. It's really stayed with me. I would love to see it as a movie. I think like the way that it read came off like a movie. Like it was just really thrilling. Have you thought about that at all?
We've definitely thought about it. Axel says that he wants Denzel Washington to play him. He said it might be a little bit too old for that role. I don't know, but who knows? Maybe you could kill it. Yeah, I mean, of course, I would love for it to be a movie. Hollywood is very fickle, and you never want to say, "Oh yeah, like we're about to blah blah blah." But what can I say about it? We're very hopeful that we'll have good news about that, and that's all I can really say right now because yeah, things change day by day. But we're hopeful, maybe. Yeah.
Love to hear that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Other question?
I have two thoughts that I wanted to share. The first one was, coincidentally, I started reading this book during the same week that I started talking a little bit about borders in one of the classes that I'm teaching. The classes is called the Politicized Altar, but we do talk about the border, of course, because most of my focus is on the that is for the feminicidios and suicides.
Oh, yeah.
And so when I started reading the book, the first few pages, you know, of course, I can understand the book. It speaks to me directly because I am from the border, and these are the stories that I grew up with. But then at the same time, I had a class. We were talking about the border, and in class, I had a couple of students who unfortunately are still, you know, they believe the rhetoric of the border and the migrants, and you know, they believe that the U.S. immigration is keeping, you know, drug dealers and the trafficking and human trafficking from, you know, crossing the border and therefore not being able to be saved. And so, because then at some point I even considered switching the reading for the second part of the discussion on border. But then based on the students' responses and the way that the book starts, I said, oh no, I can't do that. Because so kind of reiterating a little bit of what you mentioned, that it does paint this picture of, it sort of leans more on the malhechor, you know, the criminal, you know, and although it does touch upon, of course, the goodness and also the generosity and that some people can be trusted.
Yeah.
I did feel that it leaned a little bit more towards, and so I just kind of wondered, like, what you thought about that, and because then to connect that to strategic politics, you know, and the sublime is beautiful. I think that the strategy of writing a book like this could be that. How do we strategize in order to sublime, you know, to write it in a way that, I mean, I consider it very beautifully written, but again, because I'm able to connect to it directly, and I can, I don't have to translate it. Right?
Yeah,
no, for people who, right, who have that ideology still.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I think it's a really good question. It's something I don't think that I can answer perfectly, but you know, part of the book is me working in the immigration system in the US as an immigration paralegal. And what I found there, what I became very disillusioned by, was that this notion of the good migrant or the good immigrant is incredibly, actually, I think horrifying, because it, you know, if we are creating this image like, well, okay, in order to get in the US, you have to be a perfect father, an upstanding citizen, blah, 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 blah. Well, guess what? No one qualifies for that, right? And part of what we were trying to do, I think, is write against that notion. And what I found when I tried to talk to other people who disagree with me and think that we need to uphold the border because criminals are coming, well, if I try to rationalize with them and I say, well, actually, that's not really the case, because, you know, the CIA is bringing a lot of guns, and, you know, they're bringing a lot of drugs in the US, they're dumping guns in Mexico, blah, blah, blah. This is very state sanctioned kind of stuff. They're not going to listen. They're not actually saying that. They're not actually it's just an excuse to say that they want to close the border, and they're going to find any kind of excuse, I think. And I come from a very conservative family, like, so I'm talking about people I know and people in some sense, of course, that I love and care about, but also I'm like, dude, you're wrong. Like, and so our approach has been like, look, caravans are not perfect, but nothing is perfect. And it doesn't mean that even if you're imperfect, because I'm imperfect, because Axel's imperfect, because everyone is imperfect, why don't you deserve a life? Why can't you make a political claim of your own anyway? Why do we have to make ourselves perfect before we get something in return? You know?
Yeah, absolutely, I completely agree. Certainly so, the complexity of the human being, the migrant. Yeah, just a thought, you know, I think it's a very delicate balance.
Totally.
And then it also, but then there's the other end, like making it into a movie or a film, the danger of sensationalizing. Right? There's this fetish with like criminality and the black and brown criminal and the,
Oh, yeah.
all of that, and the poverty, even poverty, and the way that poor people live is exoticized, so that's-
Yeah.
just kind of want to put.
No, I think your concerns are incredibly valid. And I guess I will say also that when you sell movie rights, you generally don't have much creative control
Right.
either. So it's out of your hands. And then you hope that they select a director who is capable enough and knowledgeable enough and compassionate enough to talk about these complex things in a way that's meaningful, but it's only a hope, it's a gamble.
Right.
Yeah,
Mhm.
totally.
Like publishing film is like, like Luke Skywalker trying to blow up the Death Star. Those of you that are old enough and wise enough to have watched Star Wars. You're trying to get some semblance of truth, some modicum of truth through the matrix, through the system that just censor it in ways that are unprecedented. It's hard. They wanted my book, which is all about, the military dictatorship of El Salvador. Part of it. Producers who optioned the book said, do we really have to make the government of El Salvador look bad? They had killed most of 80,000 people. They were sponsored death squads the US supported. So it's really, he's right. You have no power once you give up the rights. So those of you thinking film or mainstream publishing, be careful what you ask for. Maybe one or two more questions, Laura?
Yeah, sounds good. Any other questions or just your thoughts?
Comments? Going once?
Well, I have one.
1, 2.
Primero, Lorena, you guys don't. Okay, pues
Go ahead, no, she was over there first.
Thank you. In the book, you mentioned a few times that you got there in Mexico as an unexperienced anthropologist or becoming anthropologist, and I wonder how was that experience for you of being on field and how you navigate your experience alongside the history of anthropology as a complicated discipline.
Yeah.
And an additional question to that, maybe you also mentioned that the conversations you had with Axel or the interviews rather were not on the journalistic or anthropological style, but something else. And I wonder if you could also share.
Sure. Yeah. Yes. So, the book is not a traditional anthropological text for that reason, right? I'm trying to think about, I'm trained in anthropology. I do anthropology. I am an anthropologist in a certain sense. And at the same time, because of this complicated history within anthropology, it's trying to rethink certain claims that anthropology can and can't make, certain borders it's erected around notions of truth and who can speak and when and why. This is part of the reason that, again, Axel authors parts of his own book, right? And can say on the page, I don't know what I'm talking about, which I think anthropology today likes to think that it's like critiqued itself fully, and of course our interlocutors can, I don't know, say something else and we don't know everything about them, but there's very few anthropological books where someone in the book is like, you don't know what you're talking about, just overtly, it doesn't really happen. So we're trying to do that. And sorry, the second part of your question was?
What's about the interview style?
The interview style. Yes, thank you. Yeah, so part of the way, we're like, okay, how do we do something different then? I'm not really a journalist by training. This book is partly journalistic, it's partly anthropological, but I was very inspired by this Latin American tradition of crónica, which Alejo Carpentier, the great Cuban writer, described as where the journalist and the novelist become one. What does crónica do, for those who don't know? In my opinion, I think it's probably a very opinionated opinion, but I believe in crónica's political potential because it does not go out and say, there's a truth out over there that just needs to be uncovered, and I'm going to uncover it. In my opinion of crónica is instead, it says, I have a truth that I'm creating in this book, and then I want to see it in the world, which I think is a different kind of thing. And that's, I think, how Axel and I approach this, especially Axel, even more than me, because I was trying to think very journalistically. How do I uncover this? And Axel's like, this is what is happening to me. This is my truth. This is my political claim, and I'm not backing away from it. And in order to kind of get at that, we had to do these long interviews, because I hadn't never written a book before, Axel hadn't written a book before. And then to rethink, what is the subject-author divide? And realizing like, well, there shouldn't be one in the normal way. We need to be co-authors, and he needs to have space to say what he wants. Because if I mediate that, it cheapens it. It becomes not as interesting.
Thank you.
Last question.
So yeah, you already started answering my question, by the way. My question is regarding your influences, because I thought like there's, as I heard you speaking, there's a lot of like, I thought of many people like Chu, I thought of Steve Fielder, whether filming or any, I thought of a portrait over Mrs. Sarmiento Chavez. I thought of a lot of like, it was speaking to those of you. I haven't read your book, I read a little bit, you know, I went to Amazon and I read the preview, the sample, and, but yeah, I'm curious about what are your influences?
Yeah, yes, so yeah, many of those are my influences, Crónica and Cronistas. Someone who's a very big influence on me personally is Roberto Bolaño. And his fiction and what his fiction claims to do. I have a very complicated relationship with Bolaño because I kind of love him and hate him simultaneously. He was a writer who was able to kind of have this sublime beauty in his writing and talk about leftism, but I don't always agree what his conclusions were about that leftism and those struggles. And so I read a lot of Bolaño while writing this book and was trying to think about my writing in relation to his writing and the kind of political claims that he made versus the political claims that we're trying to make. There's also this really amazing book that is incredibly underread that I think deserves to be much more read, called All God's Dangers by a man named Theodore Rosengarten. At the time, it won like the 1975 National Book Award. It was the first oral history to ever win the National Book Award. And at the time, it was a really kind of interesting oral history because it tried to break away from before oral histories more or less had been very academic. They were supposed to be like a linguistic snapshot of community. An anthropologist or historian goes in, does recording, transcribes it. And this is how people talk, this is what they think, move on. He worked with the main character of the story for many years to record. He was a black sharecropper in Alabama who had shot a white police officer in order to keep his defend his neighbor's land from the white police officers repossessing it illegally. They shouldn't have been. And so it's this incredible oral history of a black man in the South recounting what it means to take up arms to fight for what he believes is right. And he was ended up being imprisoned for many years because of what he did. And I read that book over and over again as a kind of way to figure out, as I'm working with Axel, what should he be saying? When do I need to step back and not speak? When does Axel get to say more than I can? And so, yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah.
Speaking of Axel, I want to give you the last word, bro.
Go for it.
Last word.
Oh, last word. Well, first of all, thank you everyone for giving us the opportunity to be and share with you. And thank you, Roberto, for everything, man.
Just don't hack me, man. Anything else?
Oh, there's a lot to be said, man. It needs to be said, but thank you for right now. Thank you so much.
Bueno, un aplauso para los dos.
Gracias, Roberto.
Thank you, Laura, the Latinx Center, and I forgot to mention my great and esteemed Angela Marino, who is a very special person here as well. And I thank you all, and we'll see you in the pages of of this lovely book. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's really, really an honor. I feel so very supported by the Latinx Research Center. So thank you so much for hosting the event, and thank you so much for flying out. You should really read Roberto's work. One of someone you don't want to suck up to the guy in front of him, but seriously, incredible work, very inspiring to me. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you all.